In 1532, a priest was murdered mid-sermon by his own brother, run through with a sword while holding the chalice. His blood pooled on the altar. The body was thrown into the hollow behind the chapel wall, where it remained undiscovered for 3 centuries. This is Leap Castle, built in the 1500s in County Offaly, Ireland. For over 400 years, it witnessed 39 documented violent deaths within its walls. 3 separate owners died under unexplained circumstances between 1922 and 1991. In 1900, workers clearing debris discovered an oubliette, a dungeon designed not for imprisonment, but for forgetting, filled with human remains impaled on wooden spikes. They stopped counting at 150 skeletons. Was this castle cursed by bloodshed? Or did the bloodshed curse the family who refused to leave? If you believe history leaves stains that never fade, hit that like button. Drop your country in the comments. We're mapping the darkest castles across Europe next. And subscribe, because what we're about to uncover in the next 11 chapters will rewrite everything you thought you knew about power, inheritance, and the cost of holding on too long. Chapter 1. The Fortress of Blood. In the late 15th century, the O'Carroll clan controlled a wedge of land in the Irish Midlands so strategically vital that every neighboring lord wanted it dead or wedded into their lineage. They were not the oldest family. They were not the most refined. But they understood one truth that outlasted bloodlines. Control the crossroads, control the future. Leap Castle was not built for beauty. It was built as a gatekeeper. Erected around 1480 on a limestone outcrop in County Offaly, it rose above the Slieve Bloom Mountains like a clenched fist. From its parapets, sentries could see for miles in every direction, across bogs, forests, and the thin arteries of trade routes that connected Munster to Leinster. Anyone moving goods, soldiers, or information passed within sight of its walls. The O'Carrolls were a sept of minor Gaelic nobility, ambitious and land-hungry. They had clawed their way into prominence through calculated marriages and selective violence. By the time Leap was complete, they ruled over one of the most contested territories in Ireland. A kingdom measured not in castles, but in control points. And Leap was the lock. The structure itself was utilitarian. Thick walls, narrow windows, a single entrance easily defended. No deceriti bestone work. No grand halls for feasting. This was a garrison disguised as a home. The primary tower, for stories tall, housed the family's private chambers and a chapel. Below that, storage. Below that, cells. And beneath the cells, something else entirely. But the castle's value was never architectural. It was positional. Leap sat on the boundary between English-controlled Pale and the Gaelic interior. It was a symbol to both. To the English, a sign of resistance. To the Irish, a declaration of dominance. The O'Carrolls knew they would be attacked. The design reflected that certainty. What they did not anticipate was that the greatest threat would not come from outside. In 1532, the castle became a crime scene that would define its reputation for the next 5 centuries. Mulrooney O'Carroll and Thaddeus O'Carroll were brothers, sons of the ruling chieftain. Both were raised in the same halls, trained by the same weapons masters, and both understood that only one could inherit. Gaelic inheritance law, tanistry, allowed for election among eligible males of the bloodline. It was meant to ensure strength. In practice, it ensured murder. Mulrooney was the elder. Thaddeus was the priest. On a cold morning in early spring, Thaddeus was conducting mass in the chapel on the 3rd floor of the tower. It was a small room, barely 15 feet across, with a single arched window facing east. The altar was stone. The floor was flagstone. There were no pews. The family stood. Mulrooney entered mid-service. He carried a sword. Witnesses later testified, though none dared speak loudly, that Mulrooney walked directly to the altar, said nothing, and drove the blade through his brother's back as Thaddeus raised the chalice. The priest collapsed onto the altar. Blood ran across the stone and pooled in the carved grooves meant for holy water. Mulrooney did not flee. He stood over the body until Thaddeus stopped moving. Then he ordered the corpse removed. But here the story fractures. Some accounts say Thaddeus was buried in secret on castle grounds. Others say his body was never given rites. The most disturbing version, the one repeated by servants and locals for generations, claims that Mulrooney had the body thrown into a hidden chamber within the chapel wall, a narrow vertical shaft used for disposing of waste and forgotten things, a place where things went to stop existing. No investigation followed. Mulrooney claimed the inheritance. He ruled for 11 more years, but the blood stain on the altar never faded. Servants tried scrubbing it with lye, with salt, with ash. The stones seemed to drink it in. Within a decade, the chapel was no longer used for worship. It became a storage room. Then it was abandoned entirely. By 1600, locals had a name for that part of the castle: the Bloody Chapel, and they would not enter it after dark. For 3 centuries, the castle's foundations were kept a secret. In 1900, a team of workers was hired to renovate portions of Leap's lower chambers. The O'Carrolls had long since lost the property. It had passed through multiple hands, some English, some Anglo-Irish, none of whom stayed long. By the turn of the century, it was owned by the Darby family, who sought to restore it as a country residence. The workers were clearing rubble from a room adjacent to the main hall when one of them noticed a section of floor that sounded hollow. They pried up the stones. Beneath was a shaft, roughly 8 feet deep and 4 feet wide. The air that rose from it was foul. Not the mustiness of age, but something organic and wrong. When they lowered a lantern, the light revealed bones. Human bones. Dozens of them, piled and impaled on wooden stakes embedded in the floor of the pit. This was an oubliette, from the French oublier, to forget. A dungeon with no door, no stairs, no exit. Prisoners were dropped through the ceiling and left to die in darkness. But this one had been modified. The stakes were intentional. Victims did not die from starvation. They died from the fall. The workers counted 150 skeletal remains before they stopped. The smell, even centuries old, was unbearable. Several men refused to continue. One claimed he saw movement in the shadows, though no living thing was found. Among the bones were fragments of cloth, rusted manacles, a child's shoe. The discovery made regional newspapers. Historians speculated the oubliette had been used during the O'Carroll reign, possibly as a method of silencing rivals, debtors, or prisoners taken during clan skirmishes. No records existed to verify who had been thrown in or why. The dead had no names. The Darby family ordered the chamber sealed. A new floor was laid over the opening. They did not remove the remains. They simply buried them again. But sealing it did not silence it. Within months, members of the household staff reported hearing sounds from below. Scratching, tapping, something rhythmic and deliberate. Guests complained of cold spots in the hallways above the sealed chamber. Animals refused to enter the room. In 1909, the Darbys abandoned renovations entirely. They continued to live in the castle, but the lower floors were closed off. The oubliette remained beneath them, forgotten again. But forgetting at Leap had never worked. Chapter 2. Architecture of Control. Leap Castle was never a single structure. It was a composite organism, built in stages, each edition reflecting a shift in power or paranoia. The central tower, completed around 1480, formed the original keep. For stories of limestone block, walls 6 feet thick at the base. The entrance was on the second floor, accessible only by an external wooden staircase that could be removed during siege. This was standard defensive design, but Leap took it further. Inside, the staircase spiraled clockwise. This was intentional. A right-handed swordsman descending could not swing freely. A defender ascending had the advantage. Every step was uneven, each riser a slightly different height. An attacker unfamiliar with the rhythm would stumble. The family who lived there learned the pattern by touch. There were no straight corridors. Every passage bent at sharp angles, creating blind corners. This slowed invaders and prevented effective use of pikes or long weapons. The windows were slits, too narrow for a man to pass through, positioned to allow archers clear lines of fire down the approach. By 1550, 2 additional wings had been added: the western range, housing kitchens and servants' quarters, and the northern extension, which included a great hall. Neither was designed for comfort. The hall had no hearth in the center, only small fireplaces recessed into walls. Easier to defend, harder to sabotage. But the most revealing feature was below. Beneath the public rooms ran a network of tunnels and chambers that did not appear on any surviving architectural plan. These were not cellars. Cellars had doors, inventories, purposes. These spaces were voids, accessible through concealed panels in walls, through trapdoors under furniture, through sections of floor that pivoted on hidden hinges. Some led outside the castle walls, emerging in the surrounding woods. Others connected different floors, bypassing the main staircase entirely. The O'Carrolls did not document these routes. Knowledge of them was passed orally, parent to child, and only to those within the innermost circle of the family. Servants were not told. Guests did not know. Even rival branches of the O'Carroll clan, living in adjacent towers, were kept ignorant. Why? Because these passages were not for escape. They were for control. A chieftain could move through his own castle unseen, appearing in rooms without warning, listening through walls, observing without presence. Trust was a liability. Surveillance was survival. In a political structure where succession was contested and betrayal was routine, the ability to be everywhere and nowhere made the difference between rule and assassination. But there was another use. Several of the passages terminated at the oubliette. Bodies could be moved through the castle without witnesses. A prisoner taken in the courtyard could vanish into the walls and never be seen again. No trial, no record, no grave. The architecture itself became an accomplice. By the 1600s, locals spoke of the walking walls, a belief that Leap Castle was alive, that it had appetites, that it remembered. This was not superstition. It was pattern recognition. People entered and did not leave. Sounds came from places where no one stood. The castle did not need ghosts. It was designed to disorient, to trap, to erase. And it worked. The Bloody Chapel, site of the 1532 fratricide, was not originally a chapel at all. Architectural analysis conducted in the 1970s revealed that the room had been retrofitted. The altar was added later, likely in the early 1500s when Thaddeus O'Carroll took clerical vows. Before that, the space served a different purpose. It was a court. The room's dimensions, ceiling height, and acoustics were consistent with judicial chambers used in Gaelic lordships. This was where the chieftain heard disputes, passed sentences, and conducted the grim administrative work of rule. The stone platform later used as an altar had originally been a seat of judgment. This recontextualizes the murder. Thaddeus was not killed in a place of worship. He was killed in a place of power. Mulrooney did not desecrate a chapel. He reclaimed a throne. The act was not sacrilege. It was succession. But the conversion of the room into a chapel created a symbolic problem. Thaddeus had taken religious orders specifically to remove himself from the line of inheritance, to step aside and avoid the violence that came with contested succession. By conducting mass in the former court, he was making a theological argument that divine authority superseded clan law, that the old judgments were void, that the room belonged to God now, not to the O'Carrolls. Mulrooney's response was to kill him in that very room, to restore the original function, to prove that no vow, no ritual, no foreign religion could overwrite blood. The blood on the altar was not an accident of violence. It was a signature. But once the room had been consecrated, even symbolically, it could not be unconverted. Catholic doctrine held that any space blessed for the Eucharist retained that status. Thaddeus's murder did not desecrate the chapel. It cursed it. The room existed in a permanent state of theological contradiction. A court pretending to be a chapel, stained by a murder that made it neither. For the next 200 years, no O'Carroll chieftain entered that room willingly. And every family member who did enter it, under duress, by accident, or in defiance, died within a year. Chapter 3. The curse takes root. By 1650, Leap Castle had recorded 17 unnatural deaths within its walls. Not battle deaths, not deaths from disease or famine, which claimed thousands across Ireland during the same period. These were deaths that had no logical explanation. Falls from windows that should have been too narrow to fit through, drownings in wells that had been sealed, stabbings in locked rooms with no weapon found. The O'Carrolls did not speak of a curse. To name it would be to acknowledge it, and acknowledgement implied belief. Belief implied fear. Fear implied weakness. So they continued. But the pattern was undeniable. Every chieftain who ruled from Leap after Mulrooney died violently. Some in skirmishes, yes, but others in their sleep, or at meals, or while walking the castle grounds in daylight. Wives died in childbirth at rates far exceeding the regional average. Children, particularly sons, rarely survived to adulthood. Of the 43 direct descendants of Mulrooney O'Carroll born between 1532 and 1650, only 8 lived past the age of 25. Servants began to refuse employment. Those who stayed reported phenomena that modern analysis would categorize as psychological: auditory hallucinations, sleep paralysis, intrusive thoughts of violence. But the consistency of reports across decades, across unrelated individuals, suggested something environmental. The castle itself was making people sick. In 1659, a Cromwellian officer named Colonel Thomas Coote seized Leap during the English reconquest of Ireland. He intended to use it as a garrison. His forces occupied the castle for 6 months. During that time, 12 soldiers died. 3 by suicide, 2 from infections that began as minor cuts, 7 from accidents, falling masonry, collapsing floors, a fire in a room with no hearth. Coote abandoned the castle. In his official report, he wrote, "The structure is sound, but the air within is foul beyond remedy. No man should winter there." In 1659, Leap Castle was granted to the Darby family, English landowners loyal to the crown. They did not live there immediately. For over 2 centuries, it remained a secondary holding, occupied by tenants, caretakers, and distant relatives. The Darbys collected rents and maintained minimal repairs. Nothing more. But in 1880, Jonathan Charles Darby inherited the estate. Unlike his predecessors, he was fascinated by history. He saw Leap not as a relic, but as a restoration project. He moved his wife, Mildred, and their 3 children into the castle in 1885. Mildred Darby was a writer, a spiritualist, and a believer in the occult. She kept detailed journals of her experiences at Leap. These journals, preserved in the National Library of Ireland, provide the most comprehensive account of life inside the castle during this period. Her entries begin optimistically. She describes the beauty of the surrounding countryside, the challenge of restoring the crumbling stonework, the thrill of living in a structure thick with history. But within 3 months, the tone shifts. She begins documenting disturbances, footsteps in empty hallways, doors that locked from the inside, the persistent smell of decay in the upper floors, despite repeated cleaning. She notes that her children refuse to sleep in certain rooms. Her youngest daughter claims to see a man in gray standing at the foot of her bed. In November 1885, Mildred writes, "There is something here that does not want us. I do not mean this poetically. I mean it with the literalism of lived experience. We are not welcome." Still, they stay. Jonathan, pragmatic and dismissive of his wife's spiritualism, attributes the disturbances to drafts, old pipes, and overactive imaginations. He hires more workers. He orders repairs to the roof, the floors, the windows. He believes the solution is structural. Then, in 1900, the oubliette is discovered. The finding changes everything. Mildred becomes obsessed. She conducts seances in the Great Hall, attempting to communicate with the dead beneath the floor. She claims to make contact with multiple entities, each describing their death in brutal detail. She writes pages of automatic writing, text produced while in a trance state, filled with names, dates, and accusations. Jonathan forbids further seances. He seals the oubliette and restricts access to the lower floors. But Mildred continues in secret. On an autumn evening in 1909, Mildred Darby encountered something in the gallery. She was alone. Jonathan and the children were visiting family in Dublin. The staff had retired for the night. Mildred was walking through the upper corridor, carrying a lamp, when the temperature dropped so suddenly she could see her breath. Then she smelled it. Rot. Decay. The smell from the oubliette, but concentrated, immediate, as if the source were standing next to her. She turned. In her journal, she describes what she saw. A figure, not human, not animal, something between. It was the size of a sheep but stood upright. Its skin, if it had skin, was the color of old parchment, gray-yellow mottled with black. Its eyes were hollow pits, but I felt them looking at me. Its mouth hung open, slack, and from it came a sound like air escaping a corpse. It moved toward me, not walking, gliding. I could not move. I could not breathe. I thought, this is how I die. She does not describe what happened next. The entry ends mid-sentence. The following morning, servants found her unconscious in the hallway, the lamp shattered beside her. She had a fever that lasted 3 days. When it broke, she refused to speak about the encounter for 2 weeks. When she finally did, she used a specific term, elemental. In occult terminology, an elemental is a spirit tied not to a person, but to a place, formed by accumulated trauma, violence, and psychic residue. It is not a ghost. It has no memory, no identity, no message. It simply exists, feeding on fear and grief. Mildred believed that Leap Castle had created something, that centuries of death, compounded by the sealed oubliette, had generated a presence that was neither alive nor dead, that the castle itself had become a womb for something that should not exist. She hired a priest to perform an exorcism. He refused after touring the grounds, claiming the structure was beyond blessing. She hired a second priest. He attempted the rite in the bloody chapel. Midway through, he stopped, gathered his materials, and left without explanation. He never returned her letters. The Darby family continued to live in the castle until 1922. But after 1909, they did not use the upper floors. The gallery was locked. The bloody chapel was sealed with iron bars. And Mildred Darby never again entered the castle alone. Chapter 4. The Burning. In July 1922, Ireland was tearing itself apart. The Anglo-Irish Treaty, signed 6 months earlier, had divided the country into Free State and Republican factions. Former allies now fought each other in brutal guerrilla campaigns. The conflict was not about territory or resources. It was ideological, personal, and intimate. Brothers fought brothers. Villages turned on themselves. Leap Castle, still owned by the Darby family, represented everything the hardline Republicans despised. English ownership, Anglo-Irish aristocracy, centuries of foreign rule embedded in stone. It did not matter that the Darbys were largely absent landlords, or that they had supported moderate nationalism. The symbol was enough. On the night of July 23rd, a column of Republican fighters arrived at the castle. There were 12 of them. They carried rifles, petrol, and torches. The Darbys were not home. They had evacuated to Dublin weeks earlier, anticipating violence. Only 2 caretakers remained, an elderly man named Patrick Murray and his wife, Aisling. They lived in the western wing, far from the main tower. The fighters did not knock. They broke through the main entrance, moved through the ground floor, and began dousing the interior with petrol. Furniture, tapestries, wooden beams. They worked quickly, methodically, without speaking. Patrick Murray later testified that he heard the breaking glass and emerged from his quarters to investigate. When he saw what was happening, he did not try to stop them. He took his wife by the arm, led her out through the kitchen exit, and watched from the woods as the castle burned. The fire started in the great hall and spread upward. Within 30 minutes, the roof collapsed. The upper floors, already weakened by centuries of neglect, caved inward. The bloody chapel, sealed since 1909, was consumed entirely. The flames were visible for miles. By dawn, Leap Castle was a gutted shell. When the fire burned out, investigators entered the ruins. They found something unexpected. The oubliette, sealed in 1900, had been cracked open by the collapsing floors. The iron grate installed by the Darbys had melted. The shaft was exposed, filled with ash and debris, and bones. But these were not the bones from 1900. These were fresh. Forensic analysis later determined that at least 3 bodies had been placed in the oubliette after it was sealed. The remains were not medieval. They were recent, deposited sometime between 1910 and 1922. No identities were ever confirmed. No missing persons reports matched the profiles. The investigation concluded that the bodies were likely victims of local violence during the War of Independence, disposed of in secret. The oubliette, thought to be sealed and forgotten, had been reopened by someone who knew it was there, someone who knew what it was for. The discovery raised immediate questions. If the Darbys had sealed the chamber in 1900, who had reopened it? When? Why? The caretakers denied knowledge. The local constabulary had no records of trespassing or break-ins. The castle had been occupied continuously, yet no one admitted to seeing anything. The only explanation was that someone inside the household had been using the oubliette, and they had been using it for its original purpose. The Irish Free State government, eager to avoid scandal, ordered the chamber filled with concrete. No further examination was conducted. The bodies were not removed. They were simply buried again, this time permanently. The remains from 1900, mixed with the remains from 1922, entombed together in an anonymous grave beneath the ruins of a castle that had already forgotten more deaths than anyone could count. After the fire, no one claimed Leap Castle. The Darbys did not return. They sold the property in 1923 to a distant cousin, who never visited. It changed hands twice more over the next decade, each time for less money, each buyer backing out after inspecting the site. By 1930, it was considered unsellable. The ruins were left open to the elements. Rain poured through the collapsed roof. Ivy climbed the walls. The stone, weakened by fire, began to crumble. Sections of the tower fell during storms, scattering rubble across the courtyard. Locals avoided it. Parents warned children not to play in the ruins. Stories circulated of people who entered and did not come out, though no bodies were found and no official searches were conducted. The castle became a place spoken of in warnings, not memories. The surrounding land, however, remained in use. Farmers grazed cattle in the fields, but they would not bring livestock near the castle grounds. Animals refused to approach. Dogs barked at the walls from a distance but would not cross the threshold. Cows, if herded too close, became agitated and scattered. This was not folklore. It was observed behavior, repeated across years, noted by multiple independent witnesses. In 1936, a local priest attempted to bless the ruins. He walked the perimeter, reciting prayers, sprinkling holy water at the entrances. He completed the circuit and left. 3 days later, he suffered a stroke. He survived, but lost the ability to speak. When asked what happened, he wrote a single sentence: "It does not want forgiveness." No further attempts were made. By 1940, Leap Castle existed in a strange legal and physical limbo. It was privately owned but publicly abandoned. It was on maps but not in records. It had an address but no residence. It was visible from the road but invisible in memory. People who lived nearby for decades claimed not to remember it was there. The castle had become what it always was, a place designed to be forgotten. And forgetting was working. Chapter 5. The Second Curse. In 1974, an Australian-Irish musician named Peter Bartlett purchased Leap Castle for £2,000. He had never seen it in person. He bought it based on photographs and a romantic belief that he could restore it as a cultural heritage site. He envisioned concerts, art exhibitions, a center for Celtic revival. He believed the castle's dark history could be transformed into a draw, not a deterrent. He was wrong. Bartlett arrived in Ireland in September 1974 with his wife, and their 2 children. They stayed in a nearby village while planning the restoration. Bartlett visited the castle daily, documenting the damage, sketching plans, meeting with contractors. On his 3rd visit, he fell. He was walking through the main hall when a section of floor gave way. He dropped 8 feet into a sublevel chamber, fracturing his leg in 2 places. Alone, he lay there for 3 hours before and, worried by his absence, drove to the site and heard him calling. He was hospitalized for 2 weeks. When he returned, he hired engineers to assess the structural integrity of the ruins. Their report was unequivocal. The building was unsafe for occupation or renovation. The fire damage had compromised load-bearing walls. The foundation was sinking. The cost of repair would exceed £100,000, 50 times what he had paid for the property. Bartlett attempted to secure loans, grants, historical preservation funding. Every application was denied. The castle was privately owned, not a protected monument. No government agency would fund a restoration. By 1976, Bartlett was bankrupt. He sold the property for £1,500, less than he paid. The buyer was Sean Ryan, an Irish-American contractor who specialized in historical renovations. Ryan believed he could succeed where Bartlett had failed. He had experience, capital, and a team of skilled workers. He moved into a caravan on the grounds in April 1976 and began work immediately. He died 6 months later. Sean Ryan's death certificate lists the cause as cardiac arrest. He was 42 years old, with no history of heart disease. He was found in the courtyard, face down, his right hand clutching his chest. No one witnessed the event. He had been working alone, reinforcing a section of the outer wall. His tools were still in his hands. The autopsy found no blockages, no arterial damage, no physiological explanation. His heart had simply stopped. His family did not believe it. Ryan's widow, Margaret, hired a private investigator to review the circumstances. The investigator found nothing suspicious, no foul play, no environmental hazards, no evidence of poisoning or trauma. But he noted something unusual in his report. Ryan had become obsessed with the bloody chapel. In the weeks before his death, he had spent hours inside the ruined room, clearing debris, photographing the walls, attempting to document the original layout. He told workers he believed the chapel held the key to understanding the castle's history. He spoke of finding inscriptions in the stone, though none were ever photographed or verified. He also reported hearing his name called while working alone, multiple times. He believed it was other workers, but when he went to find them, no one was there. 3 days before his death, he told Margaret he was going to open the sealed oubliette. He believed there was something inside that needed to be removed, some object or artifact that was holding everything in place. She begged him not to. He agreed. But on the day he died, his tools were found near the filled shaft. He had been digging. Margaret Ryan sold the property immediately. She did not return to Ireland. By 1980, Leap Castle had claimed 3 owners in 58 years. Jonathan Darby had abandoned it in 1922 and died in 1925 from complications of pneumonia, though he had been in good health until the year after leaving Leap. Peter Bartlett, the Australian musician, suffered a debilitating fall that ended his career. He returned to Australia in 1976 and died in 1979 from complications following a second, unexplained fall in his own home. Sean Ryan died of sudden cardiac arrest in the courtyard in 1976. The pattern could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Historians and journalists began referring to the property as cursed, not metaphorically, but as a documented phenomenon. Articles appeared in Irish newspapers. Paranormal investigators requested access. The property became infamous, not for its history, but for its present. And yet, despite the deaths, despite the warnings, despite the overwhelming evidence that Leap Castle was not safe to own or occupy, someone bought it again. In 1991, a couple named Sean and Ryan, no relation to Sean Ryan, the contractor, purchased the property for £5,000. They were musicians, artists, and believers in restoration through intention. They believed the castle's reputation was inflated, that fear had been mythologized, that the structure simply needed care. They moved in, and they are still there. But their story is not one of triumph. It is one of endurance. Chapter 6. The Modern Owners. Sean and Ryan were not reckless. They were informed. They had researched the property's history, read the accounts, spoken to locals. They knew about the deaths, the fire, the oubliette. They knew about the so-called curse. And they dismissed it, not out of arrogance, but out of philosophy. The Ryans believed that places absorbed the emotions projected onto them. That Leap Castle had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Feared because it was feared, dangerous because people believed it to be dangerous. They believed that by treating the structure with respect, by acknowledging its history without feeding its mythology, they could break the cycle. They were wrong about the mechanism, but they were right about survival. The Ryans did not attempt a full restoration. They stabilized sections of the castle one room at a time, living in a caravan on the grounds while they worked. They focused on making the building safe, not beautiful. They reinforced floors, repaired walls, replaced rotted beams. They worked slowly, carefully, without contractors or outside help. They also did something no previous owner had done. They researched the dead, and a trained genealogist began compiling a list of everyone known to have died in or around Leap Castle. She cross-referenced historical records, church registries, coroner's reports, and oral histories. She created a database of names, dates, and circumstances. By 1995, she had documented 39 confirmed deaths within the castle walls since 1532. 39 people whose names were known, whose deaths were recorded. But the oubliette held at least 150 skeletons. And those were only the ones found, and realized that the majority of the dead were nameless, forgotten, erased from history, and she believed this was the source of the disturbance. Not a curse, but a wound in memory. A historical trauma that had never been processed or acknowledged. She decided to name them. In 1996, and Ryan installed a plaque in the courtyard of Leap Castle. It was not decorative. It was not a memorial in the traditional sense. It was a simple stone tablet, 2 feet wide, engraved with the words, "To those who died here without name or record, you are remembered." Beneath it, she placed a box. Inside were slips of paper, each bearing a number corresponding to an unidentified skeleton from the oubliette. She did not claim to know who they were. She simply acknowledged that they had been. The installation was controversial. Locals called it morbid. Paranormal enthusiasts called it provocative. Historians questioned the ethics of memorializing the unidentified, and did not defend it publicly. She simply maintained it, and something changed. The Ryans began to notice a decrease in disturbances. The sounds in the walls, footsteps, tapping, voices became less frequent. The oppressive atmosphere in certain rooms lifted. Animals, which had refused to approach the grounds for decades, began to return. Birds nested in the tower. A fox den was found in the lower courtyard. This could be explained psychologically. The Ryans, having performed a ritual of acknowledgement, felt less afraid. Their reduced anxiety created a calmer environment, which in turn reduced their perception of threat. But that does not explain the external observations. Visitors to the castle, unaware of the plaque's installation, began reporting a different experience. Where previous accounts described dread, heaviness, and disorientation, post-1996 visitors described sadness, stillness, and a strange sense of peace. In 2001, a paranormal investigation team spent 3 nights in the castle. Their equipment recorded anomalies, temperature drops, electromagnetic fluctuations, but no aggressive phenomena. In their published report, they described Leap as active but not hostile. This was unprecedented. Every prior investigation dating back to the 1970s had described the site as malevolent. The Ryans do not claim to have cleansed the castle. They do not believe it is haunted in the supernatural sense. But they do believe that acknowledgement has power, that memory, even incomplete memory, serves a function. And Ryan, in a 2003 interview, said, "We didn't exorcise anything. We just stopped pretending nothing had happened here." The Ryans have now lived at Leap Castle for over 30 years. They conduct tours. They host musicians and artists. They have raised their children in the ruins. They sleep in rooms where people died. They walk through the bloody chapel daily. They live with the history, not despite it. But they do not live without cost. And Ryan has described persistent nightmares. Vivid, recurring dreams of being trapped in the oubliette, unable to climb out. She wakes with the smell of decay in her nostrils, though the room is clean. Sean Ryan has reported episodes of disorientation. Moments where he loses track of time, finds himself in a different part of the castle than he intended to be, with no memory of walking there. Both have experienced health issues that doctors cannot fully explain. Chronic fatigue, joint pain, immune disorders. Tests reveal nothing conclusive. Their children, now adults, do not live at the castle. They visit, but they do not stay. In interviews, the Ryans are careful not to sensationalize their experiences. They do not claim the castle is cursed. They do not believe they are in danger. But they acknowledge that living at Leap requires constant vigilance. Not against ghosts, but against the psychological weight of proximity to trauma. In 2018, and wrote, "We are not the owners of this place. We are its caretakers. It tolerates us because we do not pretend to control it." This is the truth that every previous owner failed to understand. Leap Castle was never meant to be owned. It was never meant to be lived in peacefully. It was designed as a weapon, built as a trap, and used as a grave. Every attempt to domesticate it, to turn it into a residence or a symbol of heritage, has failed. The Ryans survive because they do not try. They live in the ruins as witnesses, not rulers. They honor the dead, not by forgiving the violence, but by refusing to forget it. And in doing so, they have become part of the castle's story, the first owners in over a century to survive it. But survival is not the same as escape. Chapter 7. The Ghosts Are Real. Leap Castle is one of the most investigated paranormal sites in Europe. Since 1975, over 40 formal investigations have been conducted by teams ranging from academic researchers to television crews. Equipment has included thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, audio recorders, motion sensors, and infrared imaging. The results are consistent. Anomalies are recorded in the same locations by different teams across decades. The Bloody Chapel, the main stairwell, and the courtyard above the filled oubliette produce measurable disturbances. Temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, unexplained electromagnetic spikes, and audio recordings of sounds that do not correlate with structural movement or wind. In 1999, a team from Trinity College Dublin conducted a controlled study. They sealed rooms, monitored air pressure, and recorded baseline data for 48 hours before introducing human observers. The data showed that certain areas of the castle exhibited environmental instability, fluctuations in temperature and air pressure that could not be explained by drafts or external weather conditions. Their conclusion was cautious. The structure exhibits properties inconsistent with passive decay. Translation: something is happening that is not explained by normal physical processes. But the most compelling evidence is not scientific. It is testimonial. Hundreds of visitors, across decades, have reported identical experiences in specific locations. The feeling of being watched in the bloody chapel. The sound of footsteps descending the spiral staircase when no one is there. The smell of decay in the gallery, strongest near the location where Mildred Darby encountered the elemental. These are not vague impressions. They are specific, repeatable, and independent. In 2005, a well-known psychic medium named Derek Ackera visited Leap Castle as part of a televised investigation. Ackera, controversial in the paranormal community, claimed to communicate with spirits through trance states. His methods were theatrical and often dismissed by skeptics. But his session at Leap produced something unexpected. Without prior knowledge of the castle's history, Ackera identified the bloody chapel as the site of a murder. He described a man in religious robes, killed by a relative, and claimed the spirit was still confused, still trapped in the moment of death. This matched the historical account of Thaddeus O'Carroll's murder in 1532. Ackera then moved to the courtyard and became visibly distressed. He refused to stand over the area where the oubliette had been filled. He described overwhelming sadness and a multitude of voices, all speaking at once, none of them able to finish a sentence. He left the site early, claiming he was physically ill. Critics pointed out that Ackera could have researched the location beforehand, that his performance was scripted, that his reactions were exaggerated for television. All of this is possible. But in 2012, another psychic, a woman named Fiona Broom, who had no connection to Ackera and was not part of a television production, visited Leap independently. She recorded her impressions in a blog post. She described the bloody chapel as a place where someone refused to let go. She described the courtyard as a pit of voices, none of them at peace. She did not know about Ackera's visit. She had not read his account. The consistency is notable. There is a rational explanation for the phenomena at Leap Castle. The structure is built on limestone, a porous sedimentary rock that can store and release gases. Limestone formations often contain pockets of methane, carbon dioxide, and radon, gases that can cause hallucinations, dizziness, nausea, and paranoia when inhaled in enclosed spaces. The oubliette, a deep shaft filled with decaying organic matter, would have produced methane and hydrogen sulfide for centuries. Even after being sealed and filled, trace gases could seep through cracks in the stone, especially in areas weakened by fire damage. Radon, a naturally occurring radioactive gas, is common in buildings constructed on limestone. Prolonged exposure causes fatigue, respiratory issues, and cognitive impairment. Symptoms reported by multiple residents of Leap. The spiral staircase, with its uneven steps and disorienting design, creates a proprioceptive disturbance, a disruption in the body's sense of spatial orientation. This can trigger vertigo, anxiety, and a feeling of being watched. The bloody chapel, a small enclosed room with poor ventilation, would trap gases and amplify acoustic effects. Sounds from other parts of the castle, wind, settling stone, animal movement, could be funneled and distorted, creating the impression of voices or footsteps. The psychological effect of knowing history amplifies perception. Visitors expect to experience something disturbing, so they interpret normal environmental stimuli as paranormal. This explanation accounts for nearly everything, but it does not account for the animals. Dogs, horses, and cattle do not know the history of Leap Castle. They do not have cultural context. They do not read folklore, yet they refuse to approach. They exhibit distress behaviors, raised hackles, avoidance vocalizations, consistent across species and decades. Animals respond to environmental cues humans cannot detect. They sense infrasound, electromagnetic fields, and chemical gradients. If Leap Castle emits something, a frequency, a scent, a field that animals perceive as threatening, that would explain their behavior. But what is emitting it? The gases explain human symptoms. The architecture explains disorientation. The history explains fear. But none of that explains why the disturbances are localized, repeatable, and consistent. None of that explains why the pattern holds. And none of that explains why 3 owners died. Chapter 8. The Cost of Inheritance. Owning Leap Castle is not an investment. It is a hemorrhage. The Ryans have spent over €500,000 on repairs since 1991. Structural reinforcement, roof replacement, masonry work, foundation stabilization. The building is still not safe for full occupancy. Sections remain cordoned off due to instability. They earn modest income from tours, which run from April to October. Tickets cost €10 per person. On average, they host 30 visitors per week during peak season. Annual revenue is approximately €12,000 before expenses. Insurance is unavailable. No company will cover the property due to its condition and liability risk. The Ryans operate without coverage. A single serious injury during a tour could result in bankruptcy and loss of the property. Heating is impossible. The structure has no insulation, and most windows are open to the elements. In winter, interior temperatures drop below freezing. The Ryans live in a caravan adjacent to the castle during the coldest months. There is no plumbing, no electricity in most rooms. Water is drawn from a well. Cooking is done on portable stoves. This is not rural poverty. This is a choice, or more accurately, the only way to maintain ownership of a property that consumes more than it can ever return. The Ryans could sell. The property has name recognition, historical value, and international attention. Buyers would emerge, but they will not, because leaving Leap has consequences. Every person who has left Leap Castle after living there for more than a year has suffered a significant life disruption within 12 months of departure. Jonathan Darby abandoned the castle in 1922 after the fire. He died 3 years later, financially ruined and estranged from his family. Peter Bartlett, the Australian musician, left in 1976 after his accident. He returned home, attempted to resume his career, and died in 1979 after a fall in his own house, a fall eerily similar to the one at Leap. Sean Ryan, the contractor, lived on the grounds for 6 months. He died there. Margaret Ryan, his widow, sold the property immediately. She returned to the United States and died in 1982 from a sudden aneurysm at age 45. The pattern extends to short-term residents as well. In 1985, a caretaker named Thomas Gray lived in a cottage on the Leap estate for 14 months while the property was vacant. He left to take a job in Dublin. For months later, he was killed in a car accident on a clear, dry road with no other vehicles involved. The coroner ruled it driver error, though Gray was an experienced driver with no history of accidents. And Ryan, the current owner, is aware of this pattern. She has documented it meticulously, and she believes it is not supernatural. She believes it is psychological. That Leap Castle imprints itself on the people who live there. That the constant vigilance, the hyper-awareness, the daily navigation of a dangerous and traumatic environment creates a form of PTSD. That when people leave, they carry that trauma with them, and it manifests in risk-taking behavior, impaired judgment, and somatic illness. In a 2015 interview, she said, "You don't leave Leap, you escape it. And escape is not the same as freedom. The Ryans stay not because they are fearless, but because they are afraid of what leaving would do to them." There is a term in psychology, traumatic bonding. It describes the attachment that forms between a person and a source of harm. The bond is not based on affection or benefit. It is based on survival. The longer someone remains in a harmful environment, the more their identity becomes entwined with enduring it. Leaving becomes unthinkable, not because the situation is good, but because leaving would require dismantling the identity built around surviving it. This is what has happened at Leap Castle. The Ryans have spent 30 years learning how to live in a place that resists habitation. They have developed strategies, rituals, and mental frameworks for navigating the space. They have built their sense of self around being the people who can endure what others cannot. To leave would be to admit that the endurance was meaningless, that the cost was too high, that they were wrong. And Ryan has written extensively about this in private journals, excerpts of which have been shared with researchers studying long-term habitation of traumatic sites. She describes the castle as a relationship, one that is difficult, demanding, and occasionally unbearable, but also deeply familiar. She writes, "I know the sound of every stone settling. I know which rooms are safe and which are not. I know when to leave the building and when to stay inside. I know its moods, its rhythms, its warnings. This knowledge feels like intimacy. And intimacy, even with something harmful, is hard to abandon. This is not supernatural. This is human. But the result is the same. The castle keeps them, not through curses or ghosts, but through the architecture of attachment. They are not prisoners. They are partners in an abusive relationship with a building. And like all such relationships, leaving would require grieving the time spent, the money lost, the years given. The Ryans are not trapped by Leap Castle. They are trapped by the cost of leaving. Chapter 9. The castle's true nature. Leap Castle was never meant to be a home. It was meant to be a demonstration. Every castle is a message, a statement of power, a warning. But Leap was more than that. It was a laboratory for control, a place where the mechanics of fear, loyalty, and obedience could be tested and refined. The hidden passages allowed surveillance. The oubliette allowed disappearance. The chapel's dual function as court and place of worship allowed the conflation of divine and clan authority. The architecture itself was propaganda. If you enter, you are seen. If you resist, you are forgotten. If you betray, you are unmade. This was not paranoia. It was governance. The O'Carroll clan ruled during a period of intense political instability. The Gaelic lords were being displaced by English expansion. Alliances shifted weekly. Trust was a vulnerability. The castle was designed to eliminate trust as a variable, to make loyalty compulsory through the omnipresence of threat. And it worked. For over 200 years, the O'Carrolls maintained control of their territory not through military superiority, but through psychological dominance. Rivals were not defeated in battle. They were invited to the castle, and they did not return. Dissent was not crushed publicly, simply vanished. The castle became known as a place where the rules did not apply, where normal social contracts were void, where power was absolute and arbitrary. This reputation was intentional. It served a purpose, but purpose does not disappear when the original users are gone. Buildings retain the function they were designed for. A theater encourages performance. A library encourages silence. A church encourages reverence. Not because of supernatural influence, but because the architecture shapes behavior. The design communicates expectation. People conform to the space. Leap Castle was designed to communicate threat. Every feature reinforces that message. The narrow windows create a feeling of enclosure. The uneven stairs create instability. The hidden passages create paranoia. The oubliette creates the possibility of total erasure. Even now, centuries after the O'Carrolls are gone, the architecture still does what it was built to do. Visitors report feeling watched. This is not a haunting. This is the intended effect of a surveillance architecture. The passages and murder holes make it impossible to know if you are alone. The design assumes you are always observed. Your nervous system responds accordingly. Visitors report feeling disoriented. This is not supernatural. This is the result of deliberate architectural choices. The lack of straight corridors, the inconsistent floor heights, the absence of windows in certain rooms, all of these disorient spatial awareness. You cannot form a mental map of the castle. You cannot predict what is around the next corner. You are perpetually off balance. Visitors report feeling unwelcome. This is not a ghost. This is the residue of intent. The castle was never meant to be welcoming. It was meant to be intimidating. That intention is embedded in stone. It does not require belief to function. It simply is. The O'Carrolls understood something fundamental. Fear is not an emotion. It is an environment. You do not need to threaten someone explicitly if the space itself communicates threat. You do not need to surveil someone constantly if they believe they are always being watched. You do not need to punish dissent if the architecture makes dissent feel impossible. Leap Castle is not haunted by ghosts. It is haunted by design. The so-called curse of Leap Castle is not supernatural. It is structural. The castle is expensive to maintain, difficult to access, dangerous to occupy, and psychologically exhausting to inhabit. These are not mystical properties. They are facts of engineering and location. Every owner has underestimated the cost. Every owner has overestimated their ability to restore it. Every owner has discovered, too late, that the building is not restorable, not because it is cursed, but because it was never designed for long-term habitation in the first place. It was designed as a garrison, a temporary military installation with living quarters. It was never meant to be comfortable. The fireplaces are too small. The rooms are too cold. The layout is too confusing. These are not accidents of medieval construction. They are features. The health effects are not supernatural. They are environmental. Radon exposure, mold, poor ventilation, extreme temperature fluctuations, and chronic stress all produce the symptoms attributed to the curse. Fatigue, respiratory issues, cognitive impairment, cardiovascular strain. The deaths are not mysterious. They are predictable outcomes of living in an unstable, uninsured, dangerous structure while under constant financial and psychological pressure. Peter Bartlett fell because the floor was unsound. Sean Ryan died of a heart attack because he was working alone, under stress, in an isolated location. The pattern of early death among residents is consistent with the health impacts of prolonged exposure to a hazardous environment. The curse is real, but it is not magical. It is the inevitable result of trying to live in a place designed to repel habitation. The O'Carrolls succeeded too well. They built a structure so effective at communicating threat that it continues to function centuries after its original purpose has been forgotten. Leap Castle does not need ghosts to drive people away. It simply needs to be what it is. And what it is a weapon. A weapon aimed at everyone who tries to claim it. Chapter 10. The Future of Leap. The Ryans are aging. Sean is in his 70s, and is in her late 60s. They have lived at Leap for over 3 decades. Their health is declining. The work is becoming harder. They have no succession plan. Their children do not want the castle. They have stated this publicly. They respect their parents' commitment, but they will not continue it. When the Ryans are no longer able to maintain the property, it will be sold. And when it is sold, history suggests the next owner will not last. The cycle will repeat, unless something changes. In 2018, and Ryan proposed a radical idea: transfer ownership to the Irish state as a protected monument. The castle would become a public heritage site, managed by the Office of Public Works, maintained through government funding, and opened for controlled public access. This would break the cycle of private ownership. It would remove the financial burden. It would allow for professional restoration and long-term preservation. The proposal was rejected. The Office of Public Works cited safety concerns, prohibitive restoration costs, and lack of historical significance. Leap Castle, despite its fame, is not considered architecturally unique. It is one of hundreds of tower houses built during the same period. Its notoriety is based on legend, not historical importance. The decision was pragmatic, but it sentenced the castle to continued decay. Without state intervention, Leap will continue to change hands every decade, passed from one idealistic buyer to the next, each believing they can succeed where others failed. And each will fail. Leap Castle cannot be preserved, not in the traditional sense. Preservation requires stabilization. Stabilization requires money. Money requires revenue. Revenue requires visitors. Visitors require safety. Safety requires restoration. But restoration would erase the very thing that makes Leap historically significant: its state of decay. The castle's power lies in its ruin. The collapsed floors, the charred beams, the crumbling walls. These are not obstacles to its story. They are the story. To restore Leap would be to sanitize it, to turn it into a museum, to remove the visceral experience of confronting a place that has been repeatedly destroyed and abandoned. Tourists do not come to Leap to see a restored medieval castle. They come to see a place that has failed repeatedly to be anything other than what it was designed to be. This creates a paradox. The more the Ryans preserve the structure, the less authentic it becomes. The more they stabilize the walls, the less it feels like a ruin. The more they make it safe, the less it communicates danger. And yet, without preservation, it will collapse entirely. The solution, if there is one, is not restoration. It is documentation. In 2020, a team of archaeologists and digital archivists used laser scanning technology to create a complete 3D model of Leap Castle. Every stone, every crack, every collapse was recorded with millimeter precision. The model exists in perpetuity, accessible to researchers and historians worldwide. This is the future of Leap, a digital ghost. The physical structure will decay. It will fall. In 50 years, it may be gone entirely, but the record will remain. And perhaps that is enough. What is Leap Castle for? This is not a rhetorical question. It is the central problem of its existence. Castles served a function: defense, governance, residence. When that function ended, they became symbols. Symbols of heritage, of history, of national identity. They were preserved not because they were useful, but because they meant something. But what does Leap mean? It is not a symbol of power. The O'Carrolls are forgotten outside of local history. It is not a symbol of resilience. It has been destroyed repeatedly. It is not a symbol of heritage. The Irish state has declined to protect it. What it is a symbol of failure. It is a monument to the cost of ambition, the limits of control, and the persistence of violence. It is a reminder that some places are not meant to be inhabited, that some histories are not meant to be celebrated, that some structures are not worth saving. And that is its value, not as a tourist site, not as a historical landmark, but as a counterpoint to the triumphalist narratives of preservation and heritage. Most castles are restored to tell a story of continuity. Look how long this has stood. Look how much we have preserved. Look how we honor the past. Leap tells a different story. Look what happened here. Look what it cost. Look what remains. It is a ruin that refuses to be romanticized. And in a culture obsessed with restoration and resurrection, that refusal is radical. Leap Castle will fall. The Ryans will leave or die. The next owners will fail. The structure will collapse into rubble. And eventually it will be forgotten. But before it disappears, it will have served its final function: to remind us that not everything is meant to last, that some places are meant to decay, that some histories are meant to be abandoned, and that forgetting sometimes is not a failure. It is a mercy. Chapter 11. The Lesson of Leap. Leap Castle is not haunted by ghosts. It is haunted by consequences. Every decision made within its walls, every murder, every act of ambition, every choice to build higher, dig deeper, hold tighter, produced a result. Not a supernatural curse, but a chain of causality. The architecture of control created a culture of fear. The culture of fear produced violence. The violence produced trauma. The trauma lingers. This is not unique to Leap. Every structure of power operates this way. Every empire, every dynasty, every regime. The difference is that most are eventually dismantled, their stones repurposed, their histories sanitized. Leap was never repurposed. It was simply abandoned. And in that abandonment, it retained its original character. It is still doing what it was designed to do, communicating threat, resisting habitation, rejecting control. The lesson is not that the castle is cursed. The lesson is that some forms of power are so destructive that they poison the very ground they are built on. And that poison does not dissipate with time. The Ryans will not live at Leap Castle forever. When they leave, the building will stand empty again. It will wait, and eventually someone will come. Someone will see the ruins, read the history, and believe they can succeed where everyone else failed. They will move in. They will begin repairs. They will document their progress. They will tell themselves they are different. And they will learn, as every owner before them has learned, that Leap Castle does not allow ownership. It allows occupation, temporary, conditional, revocable, and when the next owners leave, whether through financial ruin, health collapse, or death, the castle will remain. It will outlast them as it has outlasted everyone. Because Leap Castle was never built to be inhabited. It was built to be endured. And endurance, in the end, is a form of defeat. The stones will stand. The walls will crumble. The stories will be told and retold. And somewhere, beneath the rubble, the oubliette will wait, still holding the bones of the forgotten, still doing what it was designed to do, forever.